So in our project, we were hoping to see whether these machine learning techniques, which have been so successful in other areas of speech processing, could be brought into the realm of hearing aids and hearing aid design. So we were lucky enough to get funding from the UK government for a 5-year project from 2019 to 2024. And the methodology here was that we said in this project we would run a series of challenges. So these challenges are designed to be open competitions which will bring communities together and bring people from the necessary research backgrounds to help address this problem. So in our funding, we would try and provide tools, data, infrastructure to help people who maybe haven't had much experience with working with hearing impairment or hearing before, or people who hadn't had much experience working with speech before, to come together to kind of jointly solve this problem. So a lot of this is about challenges for building communities, and that's kind of what we're trying to do. So in the diagram on the right, I'm kind of showing that, solutions to this problem demand expertise from signal processing, from hearing science, from speech technology, and from machine learning. A lot of these research areas are actually quite balkanized. We have, separate workshops, separate conferences. We want to start conversations. We want these challenges to be bringing people together. So the structure of the challenges is something like this. So in the proposal, it was very clear that we wanted to run enhancement challenges. So by enhancement challenges, I mean, we give people signals. We say, here's a signal that's going to be listened to by a person with a characterized hearing impairment. And we say, can you design some hearing aid processing which will improve the quality of the signal? And by quality, I mean, can you make this speech signal more intelligible to the hearing impaired person? So this was the kind of the primary aim. But when we kind of set this out, we kind of realized that in order to do this, particularly from a kind of machine learning point of view, you actually need good models of prediction as well. So if you're lucky enough to have a panel of hearing impaired people, you can evaluate your algorithms. It might be costly to do. But if you want, a quick evaluation of something you're developing, you haven't got a hearing impaired panel, you're going to need something that stands in for them, and then you might be using an objective measure. If you're going a step further than that, and you're actually trying to kind of build your objective measures right into your kind of cost functions for machine learning, then again, obviously you're going to need something which can return prediction scores. So as well as organizing enhancement challenges, we realized we needed better predictors of hearing impaired speech intelligibility. So at the same time as the enhancement challenges, we designed to organize prediction challenges. And the idea is here that these two sets of challenges kind of feed into each other. The prediction challenges will produce prediction models that people can use during the enhancement challenges to evaluate their systems and optimize their systems. The enhancement challenges will lead to listening experiments run by panels of hearing impaired listeners that we'll provide, which then provide data, which feeds into the next round of prediction challenges. So the plan was over 5 years to organize rounds of these challenges with increasing complexity, starting off with very simple scenarios, indoor speakers with occluding noise or interfering speech in stationary environments, but then to slowly walk up in steps through 3 rounds, kind of increasing complexity, going from stationary scenes to dynamic scenes, going from simple scenes to complex scenes. So the first round of our enhancement challenge was actually launched back in 2021. So that launched back in January. We released data, artificial scenes, noisy scenes with speech embedded in them, which people had to enhance. In April, we released test data where we told people, well, here's the scenes that you've got to enhance, and here's the listeners who are going to be listening to those scenes. People submitted systems in May. Then we had a lengthy evaluation phase where we actually presented these enhanced signals to hearing impaired listeners, collecting scores. And then we held a kind of workshop back in September where we looked at the outcomes of the enhancement challenge. When we ran this challenge, we had an objective measure called MB-STORY, which we're using as our kind of first best guess of what an objective measure might look like. And we looked at the scores of systems, both in terms of the objective measure and through our listening panel. And we had a number of systems submitted. And you can see on the right there, we've got MB-STORY evaluations for these systems. over a large number of listeners. And below, you can actually see listening test evaluation scores. And what we found, which is not surprising and what we kind of expected, is that MB story, the measure we're using, is actually not a very good predictor of the listening test performance. So not at the sentence level, not even at the system level. As you can see here, some of the systems that scored best on the MB story evaluation didn't necessarily do so well on the listening test evaluation. So this, just reinforces the fact that we need better models of prediction. So this is now where we kind of are with the launch of the prediction challenge. We've got the data from the evaluation of the enhancement challenge, and this is going to feed into this prediction challenge, which we're launching this week. So we've got 10 systems that have been evaluated. We had a panel of 28 hearing impaired listeners. We've actually got a larger panel, but this is the number of listeners we've got who've completed evaluation of these first 10 systems. We've got thousands of listener responses to process noisy stimulus sentences. And the question is going to be, can we build better objective measures that can accurately predict the observed sentence intelligibilities with this data? So that's what the first Carity prediction challenge is all about. In the rest of this webinar, we'll be having a presentation by Trevor Cox, who will speak a bit about speech intelligibility models, kind of what they are, the different types of model that we'll be looking at in this challenge. We'll then be having a talk from Michael Ackroyd, who will be talking about specifically hearing impairment and the difficulties of predicting speech intelligibility for hearing impaired individuals. And then I will return and speak a little bit more about the Carity prediction challenge in kind of specific detail, talking a bit about the data sets, the data we're releasing, some of the baseline tools that we're releasing, the schedule for the challenge, what's going to be released and when we're expecting results. And then we'll finish off with a short question and answer session. So at this point, I shall now pass over to Trevor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. I shall do the usual shuffle of the screens. And I assume everyone can see that now. Please shout if you can't, and everything is working. So I'm going to give an overview in a very short time of some speech intelligibility metrics. It's not going to be comprehensive in the time I've got. But hopefully for those, one thing we're really keen on doing this challenge is to try and give people the background knowledge which will help them to compete. Because as John showed, there's lots of different areas of expertise here. And one thing I would say also, we're also really keen to do matching of people. So if you have an expertise, but you are lacking some and you want the skill, there is actually up on our website a team matching process. You can enter a form and we'll try and put you together with some other people to make a team if you want as well. So I suppose we ought to define it first of all. What do we mean by speech intelligibility? For us on Carity, it's about the percentage of words in a sentence that a listener identifies correctly. There's other variants, but basically that's broadly what most speech intelligibility is about. And it basically captures listeners' ability to hear speech and to understand it. And we're talking about speech being degraded by things. It could be by background noise, it could be room reverberation, or in this case, it could be hearing aid. Hopefully the hearing aid is actually improving things rather than degrading it, but I suppose it could degrade it as well. And our interest here is to make an objective speech intelligibility metric, as John kind of outlined, so I won't go into that again. Why might you use it? As John indicated, running perceptual tests is a time-consuming process, and so therefore we need metrics that computers can do. And then once we have metrics, we can do things like do specifications and design criteria for audio systems, for public address systems, for TVs, for room acoustics, for speech enhancement algorithms, all sorts of different systems we can then design based on these computer models. And particularly of interest to Carity is actually to evaluate hearing aid processing strategies, whether that's within a machine learning framework or some other framework. There are other uses as well, but those are primarily what I'm and the group are interested in. So current metrics, there's a whole variety, but some of the things that are weaknesses is that quite a few of them are monaural. I would say most are monaural rather than binaural, but we all listen with two ears, even people with a hearing impairment. So we need ones which work in a binaural metric. Many of them assume that we have people who are young adults, so have what quote normal hearing, but we're dealing with hearing aids, we're dealing with hearing impairment, so they won't work very well for us. And finally, what we also find is that these metrics can quite often be overfitted. So they've been developed around a set of listening test experiments, but then when you get them to work with a different set of sentences, different noise conditions, they don't work so well because they've been overfitted to the one case where the data exists. So those are some of the problems that we're kind of dealing with with these metrics we need to improve on. So the first prediction challenge, this is the kind of baseline, which you can also, which you'll be able to download soon. But basically what we have on the left-hand side is we have picking out a listener from a database. We have picking out a scene, so that's speech in noise. That's one talker, one source of noise in a room with low reverberation. And on the left-hand side, then we have that speech in noise being processed by a hearing aid. Now, for this case, we're not really interested in that. That's already been done. So we're interested in the right-hand block, which is the prediction of speech intelligibility. So we have speech and noise in the middle here, which hopefully the hearing aid has improved. We have the clean speech, the original speech. We'll have the prompt that was meant to be read by the actor who actually voiced up our speech. And then we want to get the speech intelligibility score. And in my talk, I'm going to talk about this intelligibility model, this purple block, or some of the options here. Michael Ackroyd is going to talk about what happens with hearing loss here. But actually, in terms of actually solving this problem, you could see this as being, we've got data on the input and data on the output and put these into one system. You don't actually have to have these separated. That's just how we happen to do it in our baseline. So we have a hearing loss simulation from the Cambridge model, and we have an intelligibility model, which is MB Stoy. But you don't have to separate these things out. You could do them all in one if you want. So basically, there's two broad classes which have got various different names: intrusive or double-ended or end-to-end, meaning you have both the original speech and you also have the speech in noise by the speech in noise produced by the hearing aid. And in general, you'd expect those to be more accurate in most circumstances because you can compare the output to the input. You know, can compare the degraded speech to the original speech, and so it tends to be the most common method that you have. In recent times, we've seen a growth in single-ended, non-intrusive blind methods, whatever you want to call them. And those are where you've only got the speech and noise, in our case, the speech and noise produced by the hearing aid. In general, that's much more useful because what we have is you have hearing aid processing like frequency shifting, which is not going to work very well if you're doing a comparison of the original speech and the speech and noise, or it won't necessarily work very well. So it's more robust because you don't need to know the input speech. You don't need to know the clean speech, but we would expect it probably to be a bit less accurate. So we're interested in both these kind of models, and in fact we will be doing a sort of kind of rank ordering and prizes based on both of these. So either approaches or both approaches are really welcome. They've both got their pros and their cons. In terms of intrusive or double-ended model or end-to-end model, whatever you would like to call it, then broadly speaking, and this is being very broad brush here, what we tend to see is you've got speech and it's broken down into some time frequency representation. It might be a Mel spectrogram, for example. So we break it into critical bands along the frequency domain, and along the time domain we break it into windows of tens of milliseconds because we're interested in the envelope, the low frequency envelope of speech. We have some noise, and then we have the mixture, which is here on the right hand side. And most of these intrusive approaches are essentially comparing the speech and noise spectrogram, let's call it crudely that, to the speech spectrogram in some way. And there's sort of various mathematical processes. There's probably others on this call who can name some others, but you've got things like correlation processes that exist in things like MB Stoy, so you do a correlation between the two. Glimpse-based approaches, which Cook and Tang developed, where you're looking at which bits of the speech are still all visible. I guess if you're looking at this, it's audible really, but it's visible in these pictures. You've got weighted signal-to-noise ratios in each of these bands that you do. You could look at things like modulation. So they're all doing these sort of kind of comparisons with different mathematical operators. You do these comparisons, and then in the end, you have to bring it down to one number. So you normally weight it versus frequency because some frequencies are more important to speech intelligibility than others, and you sum it up with this weighted sum. And then you quite often also have a fitting function, which then takes the estimate out of this metric and maps it onto the actual number of percentage of words that are correct. And so that's a kind of typical sort of intrusive approach to it. Basically comparing two time frequency responses is a sort of kind of crude way of describing it. Non-intrusive. If you're really interested in these methods, I would strongly recommend this review paper, which only came out about a month or two ago, because it's got everything you could imagine very nicely, comprehensively listed. So it's really nice. And there's a variety of approaches, and these are taken from the paper, but they've got lots of references in there for you to follow as well. You've got actually, in some cases, use a speech quality metric is one approach. That's even got an ITU standard. An approach that I was involved in on one paper is you take the speech and noise, so you've just got the degraded speech, and you estimate the clean speech from that. So you can use beamforming, denoising, some machine learning technique to basically make an estimate of the clean speech from the speech and noise. And then you've got both the clean speech and speech and noise, so you can then apply an intrusive method to get the speech intelligibility. You could take the time frequency responses, let's say MEL spectrograms, and you could just use some machine learning engine to approach, and obviously deep neural networks would be one thing that people would kind of think about using. Or another approach would be to take automatic speech recognition, try and actually transcribe from the speech and noise case, and look at the error rates on the ASR. That might be the error rates in estimating the phonemes, or it might be the error rates in estimating and how hard the language model is working. There's all sorts of different ways you could look at there, and so that would be a non-intrusive approach you could look at. So there's a good paper there for you to look up. One thing I would say, and I just dropped this in at the end, is that we're interested in binaural here because we've got binaural hearing aids being worn. And so a lot of the metrics are mono, but there are binaural processes. So there's two processes that tend to be simulated, one or the other. So the better ear is the really easy one. Essentially, you get the speech intelligibility metric, you estimate it for the left and the right ear, and you take the biggest value. And that mimics how people, the brain paying attention to the ear with the best signal to noise ratio, hence why it's called the better ear approach. But you can also simulate binaural unmasking. So you add up the left and right signal with some sort of relationship between the two to minimize the noise and maximize the speech signal. That's what something like MB Story does. And then you calculate the metric on this combined response. And that sort of simulates, again, the sort of cancellation stage the brain kind of does to reduce the noise. So that was a bit of a lightning fly through speech intelligibility metric. Now, I noted James Cates was on the call, and I would recommend James's talk he did for our workshop, and you can find it linked on our FAQ page. He's particularly been involved in development of HASPI and HASCII, which I haven't mentioned by name, but you could look at, for example. And I would also mention this FAQ page because we're trying to put a lot of background knowledge about the challenge up there. So please have a look. And if there's anything you don't understand, please get on our Google group, ask us questions, and we'll put more on the FAQ, because we're really keen to get this sort of broad disciplines involved in these challenges. So that's me on speech intelligibility. If you've got questions, feel free to put in the chat box, or we'll pick them up in the Q&A. I'm now going to pass to Michael Ackroyd, who's going to talk about hearing impairment and speech intelligibility prediction. Mike, do you want me to just forward when you just shout when you want it forwarded?
No, I'm going to try and share it from here. Thank you, Trevor.
Okay, so I'll work out how to unshare.
And I'll work out how to share. More actions. Oh, which button do I press? That button there. That button. Is that sharing?
That is indeed. I can see it clearly.
Well, thank you very much, Trevor. My purpose in the next few minutes is to give a high-level summary about the sort of a quick crash course in hearing impairment and speech intelligibility prediction. First of all, I'm going to sort of say at the top, sort of like what effectively is the big overall effect that most people with hearing impairment complain about, the one that essentially gets them into the clinic for which they want their hearing aids. And it's essentially that they notice, it's the difficulty they notice focusing on what they want to hear, primarily speech, when other sounds are present. So it's a problem of background noise. It's a problem of, in acoustic terms, stream segregation. It's extracting the target from whatever else that's in the way. But perhaps the most important thing to remember about hearing impairment is that everybody is individual. We always draw graphs with means and nice pretty standard deviations, but to misquote a famous quotation, always remember that everyone with hearing loss is absolutely unique, just like everyone else. As I'll show you on the next slide, the variation in thresholds and the variation in scores that you can get for people with nominally the same amount of hearing loss is really quite extreme. And that's kind of one of the things behind the Carity Challenge, is to remember that everybody is individual, and we've been trying to make things unique for our people. I put at the top of the paper, the bottom of the slide, some key citations. Important paper written by Brian Moore, who's one of the world experts in hearing impairment research. a talk Carolina Smeds gave at the recent Carity workshop that sort of gives an overview. Then there's 3 papers on each of the tests that you've got extra data on our participants. The digit triple test, which is a speech test, the GHAB, which is a questionnaire about how good their hearing aids are doing for them, and the SSQ, which is a measure of their sort of wider hearing problems. And finally, I'll point you at the Eurotrack. For those of you who don't know about the Eurotrack, it's really, there's an awful lot in it. It's a survey they do every few years across Europe, came out of something called Market Track that was in the States. It's all about take-up of hearing aids, reason why people take up hearing aids, reason why people don't. And it's really very informative. So I'll point you at that one. This slide, 15 years or so ago now, is a good, clear example of basically what the underlying problem in speech intelligibility is. What I've got, if you look at the left-hand panel, it's a plot of people's ability to do a speech reception, to understand speech and noise, and speech reception test, plotted as a function of their pure tone average. So the pure tone average is the mean of their audiometric loss at 500, 1,000, 2,000. You'd have got all of that data in the Carity downloads. It's a good average lot. It's a good average measure of what on the whole somebody's hearing loss is like. Just to remind you, an audiometric loss, that's what you would get measured in an audiometry clinic. They put you in a booth and they measure the absolute lowest level of a pure tone that you can hear. It's in dBHL, that's dB hearing level. It's not dBSBL, it's dBs worse than what a young hearing reference population ought to give. Y-axis in this case is SRT, which is the signal to noise ratio at which 50% of short sentences are identified. In the Carity experiments, we used longer sentences, so in those probably the SRTs might be slightly higher, but it's a good example. It's a good scale of sort of typical speech intelligibility. The left-hand panel is just for plain speech shape noise, and the right one is where it's modulated. The first key point is that as the hearing loss goes up, performance gets worse. On the whole, people with higher hearing losses are doing worse than people with lower hearing losses. But the second important point is the individual differences, the individual variation. There's a few people down here with almost perfect, ideally normal perfect hearing, but they go from -4 dBs up to about -2 dBs of SRT. And there's people at this end with speech intelligibility problems that go from almost normal up to really, really bad. And yet, presumably, they have approximately similar audiometric losses as we can measure in the clinic. And the underlying problem is essentially to try to work out how to resolve where all this idiosyncrasy comes from. I think it's fair to say that in the field, we believe we can solve it. I think there's a lot of us who sort of take the physics approach that as we add in yet more factor after factor after factor, we can reduce the variance down little bit by little bit by little bit. And we always have this underlying hope when we wake up in the morning that we'll come up with a model that solves it. Nobody's done it yet. Whether or not it's doable is actually an interesting question, because we know things like cognition and other sort of wider things that are actually quite hard to measure in the lab. We know these affect your ability to do speech and noise, but we still have that underlying dream that one day we will come up with a model that explains the idiosyncrasy. To try to sort of get over what these differences in SRTs actually mean, what I've done is following a term suggested by Graham Naylor, I've invented the just tolerable cocktail party density. So imagine that you're this person here in blue and you're at a cocktail party, all socially distanced, and you'll want to listen to this person who is 2 meters away. And let's imagine the level of that person's speech when it gets to your ears is 60 dB. If you then have people also talking, babbling away in these other positions, you add up the powers of their speech, and that adds up to, at your head, 64 dB. So your signal to noise ratio is -4 dB. We're assuming it's an anechoic free space cocktail party because it makes the maths easy. But this is what you could just about do in a normal hearing. You would be able to listen to that person just about in the normal if you had normal hearing. If you had hearing impairment, you wouldn't have a hope in this situation. You could only cope with 4 people in this sort of invented just tolerable cocktail party. That's kind of what it's like. It's just so much harder to understand speech in backgrounds of noise. In terms of the psychoacoustic phenomenon that's associated with hearing loss, Basically, it's all of them. They basically get worse. Reduced audibility, of course, especially higher frequencies. Presbyacusis, age-related hearing loss, starts at the higher frequencies and works its way down. That's what you get measured by clinical audiometry. You have increased signal-to-noise ratio for speech and noise, as I've just pointed out. That's what we measure using speech tests, such as the digit triple test or sentence tests. You have reduced frequency resolution, by which I mean that the width of the auditory filters and the depth of the auditory filters and the amount of upward spread of masking all generally goes up. You have reduced temporal resolution, be it in temporal fine structure or envelopes or dip listening, and reduced temporal integration. You have reduced spatial hearing, be it in the accuracy of which you can locate sounds or the degree to which you can use binaural unmasking to separate sounds. And you have a steeper rate of change of loudness with level. But there isn't actually that much change in the level at which sound becomes uncomfortable. If you have normal hearing, you have hearing impairment, sounds around 100, 110. That's when they start becoming sort of a little bit discomforting, a little bit painful. That doesn't change very much with hearing impairment. That's a problem, because what that means is that then there is a reduced dynamic range between the lowest level at which you can hear a sound and the loudest level at which it becomes painfully loud. One reason, and hearing aids have to deal with something like that. If you simply put in a linear amplification of, say, 30 or 40 decibels, then that would make sounds that would raise up the quietest sounds to a level where you could perhaps hear it, but it would also make the normal sounds that were coming in at 80 or 90 right up there past your pain threshold. So overall, what hearing aids tend to do is they first of all put in an amplification that's dependent on the amount of your hearing loss as defined by audiometry. There's numerous prescription formulae out there. The chances are if you were fitted with a hearing aid today, you might get something called NAL RP2 or CamFit or DSL. But importantly, you have to make that amount of amplification to vary dynamically with the amount of level, which we do using compressors. And the reason that's one of the reasons that's there is, again, because of that reduced dynamic range. The moment you put compressors in, you have to start worrying about level detectors, you have to start worrying about time constant, and also many things. Compressors, I think, are one of those things that look so much better in the abstract than actually when you have built one, because compressors themselves come with technical problems. A lot of them have been solved by the hearing aid industry, but they still have certain aspects about them that aren't perfect. And as I've mentioned, there's something about cognition as well. Although I've not put it on this slide, it looks like hearing loss is associated with overall cognitive loss. It's associated with dementia. And there's much research going on at the moment to try and work out which way the causation goes or if it's mediated by something else. It's also worth noticing what hearing aids don't do. If I return again to my list of psychoacoustic phenomena, hearing aids don't really fix many of these. They don't restore normal hearing. They don't make the sound natural or transparent. They don't help you distinguish wanted or unwanted sound or fix the difficulty people have in focusing on wanting their sounds. Focusing on the sounds they want to hear, which remember is the primary reason that people go to want a hearing aid in the first place. The algorithms that set the amplifiers and set all the other settings, and a lot of them are still based actually on the details of the audiogram, rather than in principle many of the other things we could measure about somebody's hearing. And they don't do much for your wider quality of life concerns, such as the discomfort you may have from actually having a physical device sitting on your ear or inside your ear canal, the fact that people generally take them up far too late, something like 10 years later than they could. A lot of health services don't have much counselling or follow-up. And what is still remaining to be the big one, there is still a stigma about hearing aids, and a lot of people don't want hearing aids. And if somebody is forced to have a hearing aid, a lot of them want to make it really tiny and invisible as what they can, which on the company's perspective is not good, because you can't make it too small, because then you haven't got space for the battery, you haven't got space for the DSP chip, you haven't got space for the microphones and all the other things that you all need in there. In terms of this list of psychoacoustics, all of these in a sense are part of the problem of trying to understand speech and noise. There's been many papers over the years that have associated each of these factors to the ability to understand speech and noise. Generally, they come out a reasonable amount, depends slightly though on the population you test and the exact one you use. There's more recent papers which I've not listed, which are now looking at inner hair cell loss or outer hair cell loss using various measures of basilar membrane compression. Gradually, the percentages which we can predict the speech intelligibility are gradually going up fraction by fraction. We haven't yet cracked it, though. We haven't yet got a nice, simple, clear model that says, if we measure this about a participant, that's their speech intelligibility and noise. But I, for one, still have a hope that one day we'll get there. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you very much, Michael. And if you've got any questions for Michael, feel free to put them in the chat box or wait for the Q&A. You can ask them by unmuting at that point. But we're going back to John now, I believe.
Okay.
Ready, John?
Is that now showing?
It is showing, John.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Trevor. So if that hasn't, those preceding talks haven't kind of, made people lose hope how difficult the challenge is, I'll now kind of come back to, what data we have and what we're trying to do. So as Trevor showed this diagram before, we've already ran the enhancement challenge, and this is now the prediction challenge. So we're talking about this orange block. What you're going to be given signals that are the already improved speech and noise signals by hearing aid systems, and you're going to be asked to predict intelligibility scores coming out the other end, and these signals are listened to by our hearing aid panel. So in the bit that follows, I just want to kind of define some terms. So the data we're going to give you are composed of pairs of signals and listener responses. So when I say a signal, I mean it's a scene containing a target sentence that's been processed by a hearing aid algorithm. And you've got a response, which is the percentage of words that were correctly recognized by a hearing impaired listener when they were presented with that signal. So you're going to be provided with paired training examples that you can use to learn from. And then in the evaluation stage, you're going to be given a bunch of signals and listener characterizations and asked to predict the responses. In the data set, there's various factors. So there's the scene itself, which is the room and the speech signal and the noise environment and everything describing the signal which actually went into the hearing aid. There's the hearing aid algorithm, which in the slides that follow is simply called the system. And then there is the listener. Okay. So we are splitting the challenge into two tracks. We are having track one, which we call the closed set track. So in this, the evaluation will use signal response pairs with systems and listeners that have been seen in the training data. So in this setup, the eventual evaluation data will be the same hearing aid systems and the same listeners that you've had access to in the training data. And then there is the open set track, where now the evaluation data has separate listeners and systems. Okay. So open set and closed set. Yeah, so in the first example, you're not having to generalize basically to new listeners or to new systems. In the second track, you've got the extra step to make. In terms of the data, so the primary data, which is already available on the website for download, and if you download it, you'll find a link to a large gzip file where you'll have all the audio and all the metadata. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking through the metadata. So the first most important files here are these JSON files called cpc1 train.json and cpc1 train independent.json, which basically give you the listener response pairs. If you look inside the file, you'll find a big long list of dictionaries. Each entry here is a listener response pair. And what you'll see is for that listener response pair, you'll see the scene identity, what the scene was, the listener identity, who the listener was, the system, which system has processed the signal. Then you'll see the prompt, which is the words that were in the original signal. So this is, I suppose you wouldn't be free for dinner this evening. And then you'll see the response that the listener made, which in this case was just freeze evening. So you then see the number of words in the prompt and the number of words that were got right by the listener called hits. So here there's 10 words in the prompt and one word, the word evening, was scored correctly. And then you'll see the correctness score, which is the thing you're trying to predict. So in this case, it's just 10% because one word out of 10 was actually correct. And finally, you've got this little tag here, which is just the unique name of the signal. So you can associate this with the signals that you've been given as well. This is actually redundant because it's just made up by the scene, listener, system combination. So that's the kind of starting place for the data. Then you've got information about the listeners. So if you go back here, you'll see there's listener ID, so you can look up who the listener is. And you'll see that for each listener, there's an audiogram. This is stored again in a JSON format. It's actually this time a dictionary, so you can look up the listener and you can extract details for that listener. You'll see the audiograms, the center frequencies where they've been measured, and the dBHL for both the left ear and the right ear. And you'll see that for every listener in the dataset. And in addition to that, there is a spreadsheet, listener data CPC1 train in Excel format, containing all the additional data. So the GHAB questionnaire, the SSQ 12 questionnaire, and the DTT digit triple test responses for each listener. I say where available because there's a couple of gaps here. For most listeners, we've got all this information. For a couple of listeners, there's a few elements of missing data. So that's all the listener data you've got access to. You've then got scene data. So if you want to find out more information about the scene itself, there's extensive scene metadata. So all the scenes are actually scenes coming from the Clarity Enhancement Challenge, which were simulated. So we use a room simulation environment where we actually mix the target and the masker, and then have HRTFs to measure the responses at the hearing aid. So for each scene, you can see all the metadata that was used to drive the simulation. There's a room description containing dimensions of the room. There's crucial information like the SNR. So this is the SNR of the signal received by the listener. Information linking to the actual head-related impulse responses that are used for this particular scene. Information about the target and the position of the target in the room, position of the interferer of the room, and it goes on and on. So you'll see, a complete description of how the room was being constructed, if you so wish. So that's the listener and the scene, and the final component is the system. So the systems are the systems that were submitted for the Clarity Enhancement Challenge. We haven't got any metadata about those, but you can actually find descriptions of all these systems if you go to the Enhancement Challenge workshop website. So there's a link there to our Enhancement Challenge website. If you go there, you'll find presentations by everyone who kind of submitted a system, and you also find an overview talk there summarizing kind of how the systems worked. So if you want to kind of get an idea for the systems and kind of what components they're using, this overview kind of tells you kind of what they were using for beamforming, if they were using beamforming, what they were using for noise removal, what kind of hearing loss compensation they were using. And then you can drill down into the details of the individual papers to find out specifics. So you've got kind of completely kind of open information here about exactly how these signals have been arrived at, which may or may not be useful to you when you come to try and guess what the intelligibility scores are. And on top of all the metadata, you've also got the signals. So for the training data, we actually provided kind of everything's open. We provided as much information as possible. So you've actually got the output of the hearing aid processor, which obviously the thing that the listening impaired listeners listen to. So these are the signals that listen to. But you've also then got the signals that were used to construct the scene. So you've got, for instance, the target, which is being convolved with the anechoic room impulse responses. So this is the kind of anechoic targets. So if you're making a kind of double-ended intelligibility model, that's going to be important to you. You've also got the targets and interferers separated, and as they appear at each of the microphones on the hearing aid device and at the eardrum. The head-related impulse responses for all the listeners, and so on. So everything has been kind of made available for you, so you actually could kind of deconstruct and reconstruct the scenes as you wish. So for training data, you're given all of that. So again, what can you use? Well, in training and development, in track 1, the closed set track, you can use all the signal and listener combinations that are listed in the CPC1 train JSON file. And for the open set track, this slightly shorter list of listener scene pairs in train indep JSON file. So these are the signals you can use for training. In addition, we're saying you can actually use your own data for training if you've got external data you want to use. Any pre-existing models, any kind of speech intelligibility data you have from outside this challenge, you're free to use. You're free to remix data we provided with you. So you can generally kind of introduce your own training data as you see fit. Yeah, so anything basically can be used during training and development, but at evaluation time, you won't have access to some of the labels, obviously. So evaluation time, all you're going to have is you're going to have the output of a hearing aid processing system. You're going to have the target convolved with the anechoic BRI. So this is so you can use a kind of double-ended intelligibility measure. You're going to have the ID of the listener who's been assigned to this signal, and that will link you through to the metadata for that listener. So you've got a kind of full characterization of the listener. And that's all that's going to be available for evaluation. Oh, I think missing from this actually is also, sorry, the transcript of the utterance in the scene. So you will be given the transcript of the utterance in the scene as well. Okay. So we have got a baseline system based on MB-STOI, which was the system we used for the first enhancement challenge. We're going to be releasing the baseline code on GitHub. So very shortly, we'll be releasing this GitHub repository. In this repository, what you'll find actually is all the code and baselines for the first enhancement challenge, and also the kind of code and baselines for the prediction challenge. So there's going to be a single repository for all the challenges. We'll be able to get the data and baseline systems for both challenges. And that will be available by the end of this week. For any further information, you've got the Carity project website itself. The challenge documentation is all up on this GitHub site. If you go to the main Carity project website, you'll find a click through to this challenge documentation site. So most of the information I've been giving you is actually coming from this site. So please look at that, and there's a lot more detail on there. For questions, you can email us at claritychallengecontact@gmail.com. And we're very happy to answer questions, about the challenge. And we've also got a Google group, so please do sign up to the Google group if you're interested in taking part. And I think I had a slide on the timeline. Oh, sorry, the submission process. So here's a timeline. The kind of training data is being released already. The baseline code will be available at the end of this week. Then on the 1st of March, we'll be releasing the evaluation data. So you've got from now until the 1st of March to design your systems. We then release the evaluation data. Then on the 1st of April, we'll have an initial submission. So at that point, teams are asked to submit their predictions. So you'll be submitting your percent words correct per signal for both track 1 and track 2. And at that point too, we ask people to submit a draft technical report. We give this light review to make sure that your system kind of obeys the rules of the challenge. We then take your predictions, we then score them because we know what the actual listener responses are. So we score your predictions and we return to you your responses with your score. So we'd hope to have your scores back to you kind of mid-April. And then we can also produce a kind of ranking for the overall ranking for the teams. And then at the end of April, we'll be asking people to submit Carity workshop papers. So you'll have your system, you'll have your scores returned. You can then prepare an extended abstract, which can include your official score and submit it to the Carity workshop. And then in June, we plan to have a kind of online event to kind of present the results and the outcomes of the challenge. We've also got plans in progress to try and organise a special session at Interspeech, which will run in conjunction in addition to the workshop. So we'll be giving more information about this shortly, but basically the idea there is that the people who have taken part in the challenge will be able to extend their papers into Interspeech papers and to submit them to the special session. Special session deadline, if the special session proposal is accepted, would be around the same time, March, April, and then that Interspeech would run in September.